Happy Friday. Welcome to the CU Try Show. My name is Samyra Leonard, and I am the program coordinator for the Trauma and Resilience Initiative. And I am here with the wonderful Kim Bryan from Rattle the Stars. CU Try is a local not-for-profit that works to address and promote messages around education and advocacy to address trauma and resilience in communities. We receive grant funding from the Champaign County Mental Health Board and additional funding from the City of Champaign. Know that the views and opinions of our guest speakers are not those of CU Try or our funders, but I am so happy to have Kim here. We know that it is Suicide Prevention Awareness Month, and we had her on last year around the same time. I know she's preparing for an event, and so I would love for you to introduce yourself and, of course, your organization.
Sure, thank you. Thank you guys for having me. So again, my name is Kim Bryan. I'm the director of Rattle the Stars, and we're a suicide prevention organization that serves the Champaign County area. I'll very quickly mention our event today for people who might be interested. So like you mentioned, this is Suicide Prevention Month, and in September every year is designated as National Suicide Prevention Awareness Month. And September 10th is World Suicide Prevention Day. So this is an international day that is recognized for suicide prevention awareness and also in remembrance of people who have been lost to suicide. So today at Centennial Park at 6 o'clock, we'll be having a walk to prevent suicide, which is for fundraising to raise awareness, to connect with people in the community who have been affected by suicide. So no, you don't have to register, but if you're interested, you can go to our website at rattlethestars.org/walk and get information. Otherwise, just come out to the park tonight and join us.
Oh, wonderful. We had planned on meeting last week, and so we were happy that we were still able to have you come on today. And I know that you're busy, and so it really is wonderful to have you on today's session. Oh goodness, I have low battery. Okay. And so I would like you to talk, well, I wanted to specifically ask you more about your organization. So I know that we had you on last year, and we have talked about the work that you do in the community, but for those who are new or tuning in today and were interested in the topic, can you explain a little bit more about the history of Rattle the Stars and specifically about your organization's approach and what makes it unique, or like what things do that other organizations in the community don't do or do differently to address suicide prevention?
Sure. And so Rattle the Stars, we organized about 5 years ago. And like many people who come to do suicide prevention work, I came into this work because I lost my own son to suicide. He died in 2016 when he was 19 years old. So that kind of set us down this road of wanting to do something for suicide prevention in the community. We recognized a need that was there. We approach suicide prevention a little bit differently than other organizations because we are really about building community wellness, emotional wellness. So our goal is not just to prevent death from suicide, but really to prevent people from experiencing the distress in their lives that can potentially lead to suicidal thoughts. So we really want to focus on reducing the risk factors that can lead to suicide and building the protective factors. So very similar goals to what the trauma and resiliency does, but we're specifically focused around suicide prevention.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, it broke up. I love that. And yes, I think that what most of our work is honestly aligned in really working to address and those both risk and protective factors, and how do we build up the protective factors so that they outweigh the risk factors, thinking about that resilience scale, tipping it over to the more positive resilience side and making sure that there are supports and services and strategies and all those wonderful things that are working to support individuals within their own spaces, the families, the communities, and how do we address those things structurally.
And so what Sorry. No, I was going to
No,
say
go
that,
ahead.
we really, while we do care about individuals who are affected by suicide, and we want to do things to provide resources and support to people who have personally been affected by suicide, the goal of our agency is really for that community change, that institutional change, change within families. So a lot of the work that we do is, really targeting at that level. So we work with, schools, religious organizations, businesses, other community agencies, and we really want to help them to learn and understand how they can support the people that are connected to their group. So we help develop suicide response plans so that they know how to best support somebody who may be experiencing suicide. We talk to them about what they can do to build up those protective factors and address those risk factors. And part of that is training. So we offer training to teach people how they can support someone who is, potentially having suicidal thoughts or, engaging in suicidal behaviors. And so we really want to teach people how to be that positive, supportive person in that person's life. And another part of that goes along similar to the event that we're having tonight is really raising awareness and letting people know that this is a problem in our community. Suicide is very taboo. It's very, hush hush. People don't like to talk about it, but we want people to know that this is something that's happening and it's affecting a lot of people in our community. So these events not only give us the opportunity to raise that awareness, to be able to connect with people and provide resources and information to them, but also it gives a space for people who have been affected by suicide to come together and connect. Because often when you are that person who has either had thoughts of suicide or made a suicide attempt yourself, or you're a family member of someone who has, or you've lost somebody to suicide, it can feel very isolating because we don't talk about it. And so people can feel like they're the only ones. They can feel very alone. And so we want to provide those spaces where people can come together and connect and find that support from others who understand what they're going through.
Oh, goodness. No, absolutely. And I know that there were a couple of things that you had touched on in terms of some practical strategy, or thinking about like what strategies should we be working to, what strategies we should be working on so that we actually can address suicide and work to prevent it. So I know that for everyone who's tuning in, we always get to those things toward the end. We always want to leave on a positive note. And I'm excited to hear about your practical strategies specifically for families and schools and teachers right now in this moment. And so I do appreciate you highlighting the fact that it is about collaboration. Your organization isn't just about addressing the individual needs, but it is also about into other organizations, doing advocacy work, doing trainings, providing resources and support so that other people are equipped. And that really is about, we as Tri, we believe that you get sick in communities and you get well in communities. And so if we are wanting to have well and healthy individuals in our communities, we have to work and be able to, we have to be equipped. So we have to provide each other with the right tools and resources and knowledge so that we can support each other. And if we can't support each other, then where do we turn to in those hours of need? So I absolutely love that. So when I initially reached out to you about a title or a topic for today's show, there was no hesitation that you immediately sent me that the kids are not okay, or the kids are not all right, addressing suicidality in Black and Latino youth. And so I wanted to know why this topic in this moment specifically.
Yeah, so this is something we've been working on for the last year in collaboration with some other groups in the community, with Unit 4 Schools, with Dream Girls Academy. And really what we're wanting to do is raise that awareness and help people to understand the scope of suicidality with Black and Latino youth. This is something that is often not talked about, and there's a lot of misperceptions that suicide, doesn't happen in these communities, and that's absolutely not true. And so we really want to be able to highlight that need and help the community to understand that these kids in particular, they have specific needs, and we need to do better as a community to address those because, like you said, we don't view suicide as an individual problem. It manifests in individuals, but it's not an individual problem, it's a community problem. And so when we're looking at the rates of suicidality in Black and Latino youth in our community, this is a problem for our whole community. Right. And we need to work together to try to support these kids and give them what they need.
No, absolutely. And I know that you had said this in a previous conversation, but then also just mentioned that it isn't a one size fits all approach. And each specific group and individual needs their own specialized support and way to address the issues. And so can you talk a little bit more about the work that you've been doing with other community partners like Unit 4 and Dream Girls Academy?
Yeah, so the one size fits all approach is something that is really prevalent in suicide prevention. And it's unfortunate because we are learning more and more it doesn't work. Unfortunately, a lot of the knowledge that we have about suicide and suicide prevention was built on work with white people. And we understand that the programs and the interventions that we have, those don't necessarily translate and aren't effective for other communities. We really need to understand the needs of specific communities and build programs and responses and resources and supports that are tailored to meet their needs. So this one size fits all approach is not working, and we understand that. And so we've been working together, collaborating, trying to come up with ideas and bring more people in from the community to get involved in this, to see what can we do to support these kids. What are these specific needs within our community? What do the kids need? And what can we do to support them? And so this has been a series of ongoing conversations. We've had, some presentations, some discussion with the community. It's a little bit difficult with the pandemic, trying to do that outreach, but we're still talking about what we can do to support kids. And so we would love to have other people who are interested in this, who really want to be involved, to get in contact, to join this effort. And so we can really build up those supports for kids in our community.
No, you said something that I wanted to specifically highlight. And know that the second part, so I don't forget this, is that we will be reaching out to follow up about how we can continue this conversation with other people in our network, but then also specifically for youth and families in the community. So we would love to do something in addition to having you on today's show. But you had talked about the specific concerns and needs within this community. And so I'd like to know, what are some things that you're seeing or hearing locally from families and youth in the community? And are there any emergent needs or concerns that you all collectively are noticing within this community?
Well, I think the most pressing concern right now, and I think anyone who lives in this community is well aware of this issue, is gun violence that's happening in our community. And I think a lot of people don't realize the relationship that has with suicide, but it's kind of multifaceted. So on one hand, we have had really significant incidents of gun violence involving youth in our community where kids have unfortunately been killed, right? This is a really traumatic event for those people in those neighborhoods, in the schools that they attend, for the people who know them in those communities. This is a really traumatic event for kids, and it is a significant risk factor. So we do know that experiencing the traumatic death of somebody that you're close to is a risk factor for suicide. And there have been instances where we have talked with service providers in the community who work with kids who have been affected, and the kids are telling them, right, that they are having thoughts of suicide, that this is so upsetting, so distressing to them to lose a friend that way, that it is leading to those suicidal thoughts. So, that's one way that's affecting kids very directly in our community that is really under-recognized. The other thing is that we have to think kind of larger about the message that is sent to kids, right? So we have a lot of violence happening in our community, and even, larger state, national level. Last year with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the protests after the killing of George Floyd, this really kind of brought national attention to this issue. But this is happening in our community as well, where when kids see the violence that is happening, when they see the police response, the way that people are being treated, people who look like them, people who they identify with, it really sends them negative messages about themselves, right? About their place in the world and how valued they are. And there is more recent research that is showing this with kids. We have really important research that is showing that when kids see and experience these images of violence, even just watching videos of violence against people who look like them, it increases depressive symptoms. It increases symptoms of anxiety. It is causing trauma, that these kids are experiencing. And what that translates into is kids think, I'm not important, right? I'm not cared about. This is what could potentially happen to me. This is what my community, my country thinks of me, right? And so it's really sending this message to kids that there's not hope for them, that they're not valued, that they're not important. And so we really have to do a lot of work to counter those negative messages and to help kids see that they are important and they are valued, and those things don't necessarily have to be their future. So that's sort of the other sort of psychological mechanism, the way that this violence affects kids. They have that trauma from that experience of losing somebody that they love, but then there's also those negative messages about, what does this say about me and what people think about me?
No, absolutely. You said a lot.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask, are there additional risk factors that you think what the research is saying is adding to these increased feelings or thoughts of suicide, or affecting or increasing the rates of suicidality in youth?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you don't mind, before I go to that, I want to share a little bit of data because I really want people to understand what we're talking about here when we're talking about suicidality in kids. And I'm going to pull up my information on my screen so that I get these right. So the information that I'm going to talk about is from the most recent Youth Behavior Risk Survey. And this is a national survey that is conducted with kids all across the country. And what we did was we pulled out the information from just the state of Illinois. So these are kids, from our state, possibly from our local area. We don't know who all participates in the survey, but these are our youth from our state that are answering this survey and reporting about their thoughts and thoughts of suicide. And so what we see overall from these results is that, this is a problem for kids in general. So we have about 35% of kids overall who say that they felt so sad or hopeless that they stopped doing usual activities. About 1 in 10 or 11 report that they have had thoughts of suicide. So this is a really high rate in kids. But when we break this down by racial groups, we particularly see a problem, girls more than boys. Girls do generally report higher thoughts of suicide than boys do, but boys can be more likely to attempt and die of suicide than girls. But specifically for Black girls, 49%, right? So nearly half, almost half of Black girls report that they are so sad and hopeless that it interferes with their daily activities. And about 28% say that they've had serious thoughts of suicide. So that's more than 1 in 4 Black girls say that they've had thoughts of suicide. And about 1 in 9 have attempted suicide. And the same thing for Latina girls. So 48% say that they felt sad and hopeless. And just over 20%, so more than 1 in 5, have had serious thoughts of suicide. And for boys, the rates are a little bit lower. But one thing we want to understand for boys is that they attempt suicide at much higher rates than girls, and those attempts that they make tend to be more severe and result in injuries. So we really want to be conscious of what is happening, not just for different racial groups, but also by gender for boys and girls, because they have very different needs. So I really want to, I know we don't want to get really heavy with data, but I wanted to make sure to share those numbers so that people really understand the gravity of the problem that we're talking about, the scope of this, the depth of this, how many kids are reporting this and affected by this. So I think to answer your question about what are the other risk factors, what is happening, why are kids experiencing this? And so I think, first of all, talking about for Black youth, for both groups, right? Racism is a definite issue, right? Absolutely. We cannot deny that this is an issue for kids, and not just things like police violence, but community violence, but also what's happening in our schools, right? Kids experience discrimination in school. And again, when youth in schools are experiencing discrimination, they're receiving those messages from their school that I'm not important, right? I'm not good enough. I don't matter. And so discrimination is a huge problem. For Black kids in particular, we also have the issue of what we call adultification bias. And so many people are probably aware of this, but this is basically a bias where we treat Black kids like they're older than what they are, right? So we look at young Black boys and we treat them as if they're adults, right? We look at young Black girls and people treat them as if they're adults. And what goes into that is this additional perception that Black kids don't need comfort, right? That they don't need, compassion, that they don't need to be hugged, all of those things. And so they don't receive that, right? They don't receive that support and love from people in their communities. So there's the one aspect of treating them older than they are, right? So which leads to harsher punishments and things like that. But then this other aspect where we believe that because we think that they're older, that they don't need care, right? And they don't need love. So again, a lot of those negative messages that kids are receiving. We also have, on the other hand, for Latino kids, this is, there's some similar issues with experiencing racism, but then we have a lot of other issues that those kids experience. So there is for, youth who have come to the country as immigrants or have family members that are immigrating, there can be a lot of stress around that, particularly if they have family members that are undocumented. There can be a lot of fear about family members, potentially being arrested, being deported, what's going to happen to them. The stress of trying to fit in to a different culture, right, can cause a lot of distress for kids. For some kids who are immigrating from places where there's a lot of violence, they have already experienced tremendous violence, right, in their home countries. And then they're coming here after experiencing significant trauma, and we don't necessarily have the resources to support those kids and provide them with what they need, because what they have seen and experienced is so much different than what we typically experience in the United States. So coupled with that, there's a lack of culturally appropriate services. And this goes for all, people of color, right? There's a lack of access. And then there's a lack of culturally knowledgeable and appropriate providers. We hear this a lot from Black and Latino people that they can't find counselors and therapists and service providers that really understand them and understand their culture and understand what they're going through. For some Latino people who maybe speak different languages in their family, there can be those additional language barriers. We have very few providers in our community that speak Spanish, right? We also have a lot of French-speaking immigrants. We have very few providers, if any, that I'm aware of that speak French. So this gets really difficult for people to be able to find those services and supports that they need. Even for youth who may, be bilingual or speak English, their parents may not, right? So then that's an additional layer of stress. So we have all of these additional factors that are going on in these kids' lives, and these are not necessarily things that, white kids experience. And so again, this goes back to this idea of one size fits all. We're not really doing the work in suicide prevention that is most beneficial to these kids because we're not addressing these factors that are affecting them in their lives.
No, and oh goodness, and you, I know you did say a lot, and you said that you didn't want to go heavy into data, but it's not going. I don't believe that you went heavy into it because this is the situation right now, and this has been what youth have been experiencing that we have not been talking about, and thinking about how those expressions look different culturally, within also gender identity, what those different forms of expressions look like. And so I would like you, one, to speak about what those expressions look like. You had talked a little bit about you see different behaviors or different forms of, or different thoughts or different forms of attempting suicide, but what type of things should people be looking out for? And then the second part of that, the second question that I had, we've talked about both Black and Latino youth. We've talked about some of those gender differences, but then there's also new things that we haven't had a lot of conversations around about what type of things are rural youth experiencing. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit about their experiences as well.
Yeah, great. So I'm going to try to answer your first question, and then I may forget the second in the process. So be ready to remind me.
No, I got you.
So, some of the things that we want to be aware of. Yes. So suicidality itself looks different in different groups of people. And again, this is one of our downfalls in suicide prevention is we've put out a lot of these messages telling people what to look for, and here's what you look for to know if somebody is potentially having suicidal thoughts. But what we understand is that can look different in different cultural groups, right? So there's different cultural beliefs about suicide, different cultural beliefs about acceptable ways basically to harm yourself or end your life. And so these can manifest in very different ways. So one of the things that we do understand is that suicide in Black and Latino communities, it does not look the way that it does traditionally in white communities. So because suicide in these communities is more heavily stigmatized, people do it in ways that doesn't necessarily look like suicide. Okay. So I'll give you, try to give you an example of this. One example that probably a lot of people are aware of or have heard about is something that we call suicide by cop, right? It's an example of indirect suicide. So basically what this is when people are intending to end their life and they want to, take action to end their life, but they don't want to take that action upon themselves, right? Do it themselves, because that can be really stigmatized. So one thing that they will do is they will do something that will prompt somebody else to cause harm to them. Right. So this is the indirect part. So with the example of suicide by cop, which is what a lot of people may have heard about, is when people will do something, engage with the police in a way that they know will cause the police officer to shoot them. Right. So for example, pointing a gun at a police officer will cause the police officer to shoot them. So that's one example of that. But what we understand is that, for example, in the Black community, this can also happen in relation to community violence, right? So people in the community, they know, right? They understand the culture and those dynamics and those relationships in their community, and they know what types of behaviors or actions may get somebody to retaliate against them and cause a fatal injury. And there's an activist in Chicago. Her name is Tamar Manasseh. She runs Mask in Chicago, and she terms this suicide by brother. Right. So essentially, they can go and antagonize somebody in their neighborhood, or somebody that they know is going to retaliate against them and cause a fatal injury. Right. Now, when that happens, that doesn't look like suicide. Right. It looks like some kind of neighborhood beef battle, people fighting, that ended in somebody's death. And those deaths are very often classified as homicide deaths, when in reality, the person did this intentionally to end their life, right? So that's one way that this kind of looks very different. The other thing that we notice in communities that have, like Black and Latino communities that have a lot of stigma against suicide, is people tend to do things that are kind of more long-term death causing, rather than a one-time immediate act. So this could look like long-term drug or alcohol abuse. Right? And this is something that happens in, can be for anybody, any racial group, but it's something that we notice in communities where the idea of the idea of suicide would be stigmatized, right? So this can look very different. So those are kind of two ways that it shows up differently. But what we really want people to pay attention to, right? So these are kind of the general signs, like, how do you know that somebody is potentially having suicidal thoughts? What can you look for, to know that this may be happening with this person? And one of the things I always, want to point out to people is those expressions of hopelessness, expressions that they don't matter, expressions that they don't have a future, right? So particularly with our kids, if they are talking about saying things like, it doesn't matter if I die, right? It doesn't matter if these things happen to me. When I hear those, I'm thinking these are suicidal statements, right? So kids who, just think that they have no purpose, that there's nothing important for them in the future, right? That can be sort of that beginning of suicidal thoughts. So we really want to pay attention to that, for kids who are expressing that. And like I said, looking at our data, we know this is happening to a lot of kids. Kids are reporting this on surveys. Half of our kids are saying, I am hopeless, right? I am so sad and so hopeless in my life that I stopped doing things. So when we see that, that's kind of that first sign that we really need to pay attention to, that these kids are not all right. Now, if kids report, if they feel hopeless, if they feel overwhelmingly sad, does that mean that they're going to attempt suicide? We don't know that, right? But we do know, what we understand is that this is a sign of distress, right? And we don't have to wait until somebody says, I'm suicidal, or until they actually make that suicide attempt before we try to intervene and provide that support. Right? We have to start earlier, right? We have to start way back when these kids are just starting to show that they're distressed. And we have to work from there, because the goal is, to prevent that suicidality from developing further. And really what we want to do, what our big goal is to prevent that distress from even happening, right? We want to stop that before it even happens. We don't want half of our kids saying that they're so sad and hopeless that they don't even want to do things, right? We want to prevent that. So again, those are kind of those things to look for. I always tell people, pay attention to the things people say, right? You're not going to notice the changes in their behavior. You're not going to notice changes in their feelings. We can't notice those things. We don't always notice them. But what we can notice is what people say, right? So when you have people saying things like, I just can't take it. I'm done. I'm over it, right? That people would be better off without me, right? I just don't care. I don't care about the future. Those types of statements show that this person is distressed, and we really want to pay attention to those and provide that support. Okay, so I'm going to try to move to your second question now. So for about rural kids, right? Okay. So some of the specific concerns that we have with kids who live in rural areas is the more intense stigmatization of suicide, right? So this, again, in those communities, it tends to be more heavily stigmatized, meaning that people who experience, when we're talking about stigmatization, I want to back up and be clear about this, because I keep using this term, being stigmatized, or we use the term stigma a lot, but I want to clarify what that means. And so when we talk about stigma, really what we're talking about is the prejudice and discrimination that people experience because of some trait that they have, right? So the term stigma actually refers to like the mark, the trait. This is the characteristic that is causing people to react this way. And then the stigmatization is the prejudice and discrimination that other people put towards that person because of that characteristic or trait. So when we're talking about the stigma of suicide, what we're talking about is that people who have thoughts of suicide or have attempted suicide or who have died of suicide, that's the mark, right? Suicidality. And what happens is other people discriminate against them. They treat them differently. They shame them. They tell them, that they treat them differently. People may lose their jobs. They may lose friendships. We have literally, and this is not an exaggeration, it has happened in our state where high school kids have been kicked off of sports teams, or kicked out of clubs, or lost positions that they had in school because they had suicidal thoughts or made an attempt, right? That is discrimination against those kids. For youth especially, a lot of parents, adults fear this idea of suicide contagion, that it's going to spread. And so if a kid has a history of suicidality, other parents may not want their kid to hang around with them. Right. So those friendships may be severed. Kids can be, excluded in school. Right. So all of these things, and all of those things, people treating you differently, treating you badly, shaming you, negative things happening to you, that's discrimination. Okay. So when we're talking about stigma, we're talking about discrimination. Okay. Now, in rural communities, that discrimination is more intense, right? People perceive that discrimination is more intense. And part of that is because of the smaller nature of the community, right? Everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows your business. Everybody knows what's going on, right? And people don't want everybody to know this. So there's a lot of fear that if somebody knows this about me, everybody's going to know it. Everybody's going to talk about it. Everybody's going to treat me differently. So that fear of stigmatization is more intense for kids in rural communities. The other major issue that we want to be aware of with rural communities, well, two, I'll do this one first. Lack of access to resources, okay? And when I'm talking about resources, I'm not just talking about mental health services, right? Because we understand distress comes from a lot of other areas. It's not just psychological and emotional, right? So when we don't have access to food, don't have access to transportation, don't have access to affordable housing, right? All of those types of resources, we need those too. And all resources, healthcare, mental health care, material resources, those things are all more difficult to find in rural communities, right? Mm-hmm. And to reach them, people have to travel longer distances. It's more of a burden. It's harder to do, right? So we have a lot of kids in our county, in Champaign County, who live in the rural areas. And if they do need mental health care, a lot of them have to travel to Champaign to be able to get that. And that can be hard for parents, particularly if they don't have access to transportation or with work schedules, things like that can be really difficult to get those kids care. So that's another major issue. But the other one that I really want to make sure that we talk about with rural communities is gun ownership, right? And this is not to say that people owning guns is bad, right? We're not anti-Second Amendment, none of those things. It's really just an understanding that we know that when guns are present, particularly in households with youth, suicide is more likely, okay? And so really, what we want parents to understand is that if you have a young person in your home, a teenager, a child, an adolescent, right? Store your guns safely, lock them up, because you may not even be aware that your child has suicidal thoughts. But when people are in a suicidal crisis, they can make those attempts very quickly. And guns that are easily accessible are very lethal, right? So there's no second chances there when we're talking about guns. And the problem in rural communities is that there's a higher rate of gun ownership. So we have a lot more families that have guns in their home. And so kids in those areas are at greater risk of having access to those lethal means.
So this one,
yeah, sorry, I don't know if that's
my. Oh goodness. Okay, I apologize for that. I don't know. We're having a tech day. I feel like it's been a tech week. I don't know. There's been like an issue that I've had every day, and I was like, other people are saying the same thing. But one, I'm aware of the time, and two, yes to everything that you said. And I think this is a nice transition. You talked a lot about like what are the risk factors, what are the different expressions of suicidality. How do we see this different within different cultural groups, different gender groups? And so to ask you specifically, we talked about like one, if you're not the stigma around this idea of like committing dying by suicide. I want to make sure that I'm aware of that language, but also have suicidal thoughts or ideations, feeling hopeless. And when we don't talk about these things, we can't address them. But then also, if we are talking about what type of, this isn't just an individual issue, it's a community issue. What would you, and we really push for community resilience and wellness, and making sure that everyone is healthy and has the access to tools and resources that they need. And one of the biggest or things that you talked about repeatedly is that there's a lack of resources. There's a lack of accessibility to not just mental health resources, but things that help you with basic living, that create this additional stress and these additional feelings of distress within individuals, and especially youth and families. And so what type of things do you think can be done at the community level or structurally to address or prevent these or address these risk factors that you had talked about?
Yeah, so I think, one of the very important things to understand about suicide prevention, because we often think that in order to prevent suicide, we have to know who is going to attempt suicide. We have to identify them, right? And the fact of the matter is, we will never identify everyone, right? We just can't do it. People are very good at hiding it. They don't want people to know. We as individuals, as human beings, we don't always notice those things about people, right? So we're not going to be able to do that. So really what we want to do is take the approach of community wellness, that if we make the community more emotionally well and supportive, then all of those people who could potentially develop suicidal thoughts, hopefully they won't. Right? And we don't need to identify them. We need to just support everybody. So, I don't want to go like too big picture here, but I really just want to like say like money, right? We need money. We need our elected leaders to understand these issues and put money towards these issues, right? So we really need funding to address issues in our community. We need funding to help people with affordable housing, with transportation, with food, with having service providers, not just in mental health, but across the board that are culturally aware and speak people's languages, all of those things. For kids specifically, we need to create schools that are supportive, right? We need kids to feel that when they are in school and when they're in their community, that they are loved and supported. And that is for every kid, right? For kids who are of color, for LGBTQ kids, right? We need all kids to feel that they are loved and valued and important and supported. And that would be, that would have a tremendous impact on the well-being of kids. So we really want to challenge our schools to be proactive and really take a step back and take a really hard look at what's happening in your school community, in your policies, within the school, the student body. Where are these things happening? What can we do to address discrimination in our schools? What can we do to make sure that all kids in our schools feel like they are loved and valued and that they are important and have a space, right? Because when we're talking about those feelings of sadness and hopelessness, right, that's what we want to address. We want kids to feel like they're important. And so a lot of that change can happen in schools. We also want to increase access to those services, right? Which again goes back to money, but within schools, one of the things we do when we work with schools is trying to help schools to understand that it's not just their social work staff, right, that can play a role here. It is everyone. It is all the teachers. It's the bus drivers. It's the custodians, right? Everybody plays a role in this, because when we need for kids to have somebody, some adult that they can connect with, that they feel like cares about them, that they trust, right? That I can go talk to this adult when I'm feeling bad, when I'm having a problem. That's not always the social worker, right? That could be a teacher. It could be the bus driver. It could be the custodian. It could be anybody. So we really want to expand and let everybody know you all play a role in this, because we tell kids constantly, right? If you need help, ask for help, right? But if you are an adult listening to this, I want you to think about, if a kid comes to you as an adult and says, I need help, do you know what to do to help that kid? Because if you don't, you need to contact us and think about training, right? Because we can teach you how to support this kid. When we tell kids, if you have thoughts of suicide, tell somebody and ask for help. They're going to go to, if they go to an adult, they're going to go to an adult that they trust. And that could be you, right? It's not just the social workers. So we really want to expand, not just within the schools, but in our entire community, that we all play a role in this, right? Everybody who works at a school plays a role. Everyone within, your church, your religious organization, coaches, right? Your other community leaders, right? Anybody, any adult who has contact with a young person, you need to know about suicide prevention, right? And that's how we can start to build a community that really understands this issue and understands how to support our kids and how to provide them with what they need. Now, after we've done that, right, we do need to address those very important resources and needs right now, right? So we need to meet those material needs. We need to meet healthcare needs. We need to meet mental health care needs. And we have to figure out as a community better ways of doing that. And better ways of reaching people and providing them with services that they trust and that they feel are appropriate for them.
Oh, absolutely. So yes, and I am very aware of the time, and so you touched on some of the things that I was going to follow up with, because we want people to leave with very practical strategies about what can I do? People always ask, what what comes next? So now they have this information. So you talked about what schools can do. You talked about what parents and trusted adults can do. I mean, not parents, teachers and trusted adults can do. But are there specific things that parents should be doing or can do? Are there specific things that friends can do or be looking out for, say, or learn in order to support others?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that that's very important, that people listening are going, but what can I do? Right? What can I do to help this problem? So yes, we want these community changes, but that also starts with you as an individual. And like I said, what I want everyone who's listening to do is to think about, if a kid comes to me and says that they, have thoughts of suicide, do I know what to do? Right? If you don't, then reach out and try to learn that information, whether from us or any other agency, right? But what I really want to recommend to parents to do is, or adults in general, any adult, don't wait for the kids to come to you, right? Because they may not. Kids already have a lot of distrust of adults. We know that teenagers especially, they don't go to adults for help. They go to their friends, right? So we have to go to them, right? We have to understand it's our problem as adults. It's our problem that kids don't want to come talk to us, right? We have to create a space where kids feel comfortable and they feel safe and they feel supported for them to come talk to us. But what we need to do is to reach out to them first, right? So that starts with just asking. And I encourage every adult, right, with the kids that you know, whether it's your own children or if you're a coach, if you're a teacher, if you're just somebody in the community, if it's your neighbor, right, whoever, any kids that you have contact with, just talk to them and ask them, right? Ask them. Not only if they have thoughts of suicide, but if they know somebody, if a friend has told them. Because like I said, very often kids are talking to each other. So it may not be that this kid is having thoughts of suicide, but their friend may have told them that they are. And then this child is in the position of having that information and not knowing what to do. So even if it's not your child, other kids could be telling your child, right? So you need to have those conversations and ask that question. And the way that we do that is we just recommend to people, try to create that safe space for kids and let them know it's okay to talk about. So you can start that conversation by saying, hey, this is a really stressful time right now, okay? We know all the things with the pandemic, with schools, with stuff like that, or around particular times when kids have a lot of stress, like finals, right? Start that conversation and say, hey, I know that things are really stressful right now. And sometimes when people feel really stressed or they get overwhelmed, they sometimes have thoughts of suicide. Is that something that has ever happened to you? Or has anybody ever told you that happens to them, right? So you start that conversation. Make sure again that you're letting them know that they're safe, that this is okay to talk about, that you're not going to punish them. They're not going to get in trouble, right? So you want to let them know that it's safe to talk about, and you want to give them resources that they can use. And I know we're going to get to those, but hotline numbers, put them in their phone, right? Plug them into their phone contacts. So
now's the perfect time.
So they can use them for themselves. They can give them to a friend. Understand, this child may not always talk to me, but I want them to be able to talk to someone, right? And it doesn't have to just be for suicidality. It can just be because they're upset, just because they need somebody to talk to. And that's what those crisis lines are there for, right? So make sure that they have those phone numbers, right? Get those resources to them.
No, absolutely. So as you're on the topic of resources, what things do we have? What crisis supports and services do you want to highlight locally? Of course, yourself, but are there other places or people that children youth of color specifically can reach out to for support?
Yeah, absolutely. So, locally, and I want to clarify. For people in crisis, they should not contact us. When we don't provide crisis support services, contact us for information and referrals and training and all of that, but not for crisis. So locally, we do have a local crisis line through Rosecrans, which is 351-4141. But I also like to highlight the national lines. So specifically for Black people who have trauma or stress around community violence or police violence, there's a resource called Blackline. And that number is 1-800-604-5841. And so that's a very specific resource for the Black community. But in general, we want to highlight the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is 1-800-273-8255. For kids who prefer to text, or adults, anybody who prefers texting to talking on the phone, you can contact the crisis text line, which is 741-741. And then I also want to highlight right now the disaster distress helpline, because I know a lot of people, especially in Black and Brown communities, have been really impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the disaster distress helpline is a resource that specifically helps people in times of disaster, including pandemics. And so that number is 1-800-985-5990. So these are all things that are available 24/7, 365. You can call anytime. There is always somebody to talk to. And like I said, put them in your phone. Just plug those into your phone contacts, put them in your kids' phone contacts so that they have them in case they need them. Oh,
So
the other thing was, sorry, before I don't want to leave without saying this too, because I want to be clear with crisis lines. These are not just for people in crisis, right? So you don't have to be like about to attempt suicide before you call, or text the crisis text line. It can be for anybody, right? If you're just upset, if you just want somebody to talk to, if you are somebody who has concern that someone may have thoughts of suicide and you don't know what to do, you can contact the Suicide Prevention Lifeline and they will give you information about what to do, right? They will help you through that. If you do have somebody who has experienced suicidality, that you've talked to them about it or they've told you about it, like, man, that's really overwhelming and distressing, because it is a hard thing to talk about and it is a very scary topic to talk about. And you need to just kind of debrief and let that out to somebody. You can call the Suicide Prevention Lifeline and they'll listen to you, right? So they provide all kinds of support. We call them crisis lines, but they're not just for people in crisis. They are for anybody to use. Even if you just need resources and information, you can call the Suicide Prevention Lifeline and they will give you resources and information, right? So call them for anything you need.
No, thank you for highlighting that. People, we talk about language and using words like crisis or sometimes scares people. And so we want them to know that there are resources available. Know that everyone who is listening in, and then also who may watch the show after, we will have additional resources attached and we'll make sure that they are included in the chat below. But I know that we are running low on time. And first, I want to thank you for joining us today, Kim. It has been so amazing to talk to you and listen. And you are a wealth of information. And so I want to, before we log off, was there any final thoughts that you had or anything that you wanted to make sure that the audience heard before we leave?
I don't think final thoughts. I know I've talked a lot, but I really just want people to understand, that this is really a community problem and we all play a role. Right. And I want parents to understand, and I'm going to say this because I am a parent and I did lose a child to suicide. And I understand how that feels and how scary that can be, thinking that, your child may have thoughts of suicide. And parents can also feel very stigmatized about that, because it can feel like I'm a terrible parent, that I failed my child in some way. And I just want parents to know that's not the case, right? It's not anything that you have done. And so really the most important thing is figuring out what your kid needs and getting those supports. And that can be scary and it can be daunting, but it's not a reflection of you, right? You're still a good parent. You still love your kids. And, you know, we just want to make sure that all kids feel like they matter, right? That they are important and they're loved.
No, I think that was the perfect way to end the show. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you for everyone who tuned in and who decided to watch. And I hope that you all have a wonderful weekend. And I think we are done.
Thank you.